Hello and welcome to the second episode of what we're calling the Corruption Files. The Corruption Files deals with corruption, whether that's from a political perspective, a legal perspective, or just a human perspective. How does corruption come about, and what do we do to deal with it? My name is Jeremy Maddock, and you will likely remember our previous show on corruption in a small town of Port McNeill, British Columbia. Today, we're going to be talking in more general terms about erasing of history. So the toppling of statues, the toppling of monuments. And I've got a story from where I live in Victoria, British Columbia, and how that's played out here in Victoria. I'm joined again by my learned friend and co-host, Jaymee Jay. Maybe she could just briefly introduce herself and tell us her interest in this.
Hi. Yeah, my interest just right away when you told me this story, it just, again, like our last episode, it just reeked of people not going through the proper process. And processes are set up in place specifically to make sure that things are done in a fair and accountable manner. And when you showed me the documentation and stuff from what we're going to discuss today, it was just clearly another case of people sort of using the system in order to accomplish their personal means without actually doing it in a way where they're transparent and accountable. And so, yeah, just looking forward to going over that today and showing another example of how these institutions in our society that people really make an assumption are following procedures that are fair and just really, there's just informal things going on that really just need to be pointed out. So hopefully we can go over some of that today and show that to our audience.
Yeah, well, that's definitely something that's bothered me for a while working in the legal field and seeing that there are supposedly ground rules that government is supposed to play by and people are supposed to play by. And to see those rules being ignored and see people in positions of power having no accountability is a real problem. And this issue here it's a fraught one. It's a political one. It's controversial because there are obviously a lot of debates about historical figures and the desire to judge historical figures by today's standards. We do have dark chapters in our history. There's no doubt about that. But we also have dark chapters in our present, I would argue. So the issue here it's against a backdrop, I think, of the efforts to sanitize and erase history. We've all seen statues coming down of Christopher Columbus in the United States, of course some of the Civil War era leaders in the United States that are highly controversial and maybe made attempts to justify slavery in their day. But then it seems like there's a leap from that to removing statues of people like George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and people who, although they maybe had problematic opinions by today's standards, were great statesmen of their day. And now all of those people need to be sanitized. So that's the overarching historical narrative that I think is happening across North America and across the world. But the story I want to tell is about a statue of our first prime minister here in Canada, a gentleman named John A. Macdonald, who was also the member of Parliament for Victoria, interestingly, because I think they needed a seat for him, and they thought it would unify the country if the prime minister had his seat out west in a place that was really disconnected from Canada at the time. But John A. Macdonald was one of the people who really made efforts to connect it by building the railway, by creating this confederation that we are supposed to believe is a strong and free country today. There's also problems with John A. Macdonald's legacy. He was a supporter of the residential school system where First Nations children were I guess it was an assimilationist policy would be the way of describing it, where First Nations children were to be educated by European standards and basically taught to be like us, taught to be like European settlers. And by today's standards, that's that's seen as unacceptable, but by the standards of the 1870s, when John A. Macdonald was in power, that was seen as quite progressive. So one can have a debate on his legacy. There are good things about John A. Macdonald's legacy, and there are bad things. But the question here is whether a statue, a work of art that that memorializes, by all accounts, a very historic and very important figure in Canadian history, should be removed. And if so, what should the process be for carrying out that removal? In Victoria, there was this process kicked off in August of 2018. August, from a governance and legal perspective, is often a slow month. A lot of people are on vacation. A lot of people aren't listening. And all of a sudden, on August 8th, 2018, with no warning, the mayor of Victoria, Lisa Helps, announced that the John A. Macdonald statue would be coming down that August 8th, August 11th. So it was a 3 days notice to the public. There had been no vote. There had been no political process for making this decision. There had been a conversation between a committee, I guess you could call it a committee, of some councillors and some others, called the City Family, which Mayor Helps describes as a reconciliation body, an advisory body to council. Various words have been used to describe this body, although it's not clear legally what it is, and we'll get to that in a few minutes. But when people, there was obviously a bit of an uproar about the removal of this statue, and some people said we need to have a conversation. We need to be transparent about this kind of decision-making process. Mayor Helps stated, this isn't a decision for the public. This is a decision for the city family. That was her exact quote at the time. And on her blog at the time, she wrote, and I quote, "After a year of discussion, deliberation, truth sharing, and seeking counsel from the Songhees and Esquimalt chiefs and councils on multiple occasions, the family decided on the first concrete action we would like to take as we continue the path of truth and reconciliation. We will remove the statue of Sir John A. Macdonald from the front doors of City Hall, so that family members and other Indigenous people do not need to walk past this painful reminder of colonial violence each time they enter the doors of their municipal government. The statue will be removed and stored in a city facility until an appropriate way to recontextualize Macdonald is determined." So this was on August 8th, a decision that is being described as having been made by the mayor, by the city family, and there'd been no vote yet on city council, which is supposed to be a representative body that represents the public and consults with the public. Obviously, that's I see that as problematic. It's one of the things. Accountability is one of the things that interested me in municipal politics, and why I ended up running last year. And I still see a gross deficit in accountability. What do you think about that, Jaymee? Do you have any thoughts on the whole accountability process in a decision like this?
Yeah, I mean, just even the name, the family, like that, just to me sounds like, a crime family, or so, like the movie The Firm, or The Agency, or like kind of just this, like, when you think of even the connotation of the word family, it's like people that are loyal to each other, based on relationship. It's not really like a public body based on people looking at the truth and making a decision. It's really based on this type of like cohesion between the groups. And just even the name, the family, kind of is a really interesting choice of names to me. And when I think about personally, I don't even really like statues. I'm not even trying to stick up for statues at all. But like what bothers me is who gets to decide which statues are okay or not, and what is that actually based on. And it seems like they're saying that they're making a judgment on these statues and then just deciding if they're worthy to exist or not. And to me, that's really scary, of who gets to decide that, because there's a power differential there. And what is this criteria? To me, I don't think that statues should be judged as good or bad. They're all part of history, even if it's a negative part of history. It doesn't mean that it necessarily needs to be erased just because it's negative. Like it's like there's another process in there where people are making a judgment and deciding what should be available as truth, even if it's bad truth, even if it's truth that's a dark part of history. Who has the right to erase truth either way? Right, is the way that I look at it. And so it's like if they're going to do that, they should almost take down all statues or no statues, because if they're going to pick and choose which ones, then that becomes a power differential. And, for some group like the family to be deciding that, I mean, to me, that doesn't seem like a fair process at all.
Yeah, well, it's in a practical way, the way it played out is there were several councillors who were appointed to the family, and they were the councillors that the mayor liked, that agreed with the mayor. So they got to have a backroom decision-making process. And the important thing here is to remember is there's no minutes taken of these meetings. Meetings are not being recorded. Members of the public are not welcome. Other members of council who aren't on the family are not welcome. So these decisions are really being made by the mayor and her hand-picked group of councillors and a couple of First Nations elders that are thrown in, I would argue, for political reasons to make the whole thing look politically correct. But it's not legally correct because it does not follow any of the procedures of a municipal decision-making body. And so when I first saw this, I complained. I filed a complaint with what's called it used to be called the Ombudsman's Office. The Ombudsman's Office is the correct term. It's based on a Norse word for representative. But in British Columbia, in its wisdom, has decided to rebrand this the Ombudsperson's Office because they thought that the Norse word for representative was too gendered, I assume. So I filed a complaint with the Ombudsperson's Office of British Columbia. And I cited a section of the Local Government Act, the Community Charter is what I cited, which section 115A says that City Council has a duty to consider the well-being of and interests of the municipality and its community. I argued that a total failure to consult residents of the municipality, together with the mayor's statement that this isn't a decision for the public, falls short of the standard established by the Community Charter. And then I sought an order under Section 591 of the Local Government Act, which provides that the ombudsperson may investigate complaints about decisions by a local government with respect to heritage objects. And I asked the Ombudsman's Office to basically put a pause or put a stay on this removal of the statue until the people of Victoria could be properly consulted. And one would think that's what an ombudsman is supposed to do, is provide a safety valve, provide a means of accountability when the government isn't doing anything and needs a check on their power. I didn't hear anything back. The ombudsman just kind of I think they said that we received your complaint kind of thing, but I was pushing for an answer right away because this was very time sensitive. My letter was marked urgent. They just shuffled it off into their paperwork, and I didn't get a response until 2.5 years later. But we'll get to that in a minute. What happened in the meantime, though, this was on August 9th of 2018, 2 days before the scheduled removal of the statue. And I think the mayor, realizing that there had to be some buy-in from City Council, called a City Council meeting to consider this issue for the first time after announcing the decision. But the purpose of the city purpose of the City Council meeting, rather, was not to make a decision in the first instance, but it was, and I quote from the minutes of that meeting, it was to endorse the decision of the city family. So that's important. The decision had already been made. City Council just had to endorse it. There was one member of council who was opposed. His name was Jeff Young. He's no longer in City Council, but he was a very long-standing councillor in Victoria. He referred to the city family as an advisory committee of council, and he raised a concern that the absence of a public process could be seen as disenfranchising the citizens of Victoria. And his exact words were, yes, this subcommittee, this advisory committee that's called the City Family has been meeting for a year, but it hasn't been a public process. It's an advisory committee like any other. Some of the members are paid and meets in perhaps slightly more comfortable circumstances. I take it from the mayor that there were formal agendas and so forth, but obviously there was significant discussion. And the problem for me is that only those members of the committee, not even sure how many there are from the city, most, I guess, from outside the city, the Esquimalt and Songhees bands and others, they have had ample opportunity to work through these issues, to discuss them, but our citizens have not. So that was that was Councillor Young's point of view. A couple of the other councillors expressed similar concerns as well. There was a councillor, Pam Madoff, another long-standing voice on City Council. She said the timing of this, and her concern was the timing of this and the way that the public has been made aware of it has made it unnecessarily contentious, and argued that there should be, again, I quote, just notice, even if council's intention is that we will respect the decision of that committee, and basically we will move forward with it. So Councillor Madoff's remarks seem to be that she disagreed with the process, but she considered the decision to have been made. She wished it had been made in a fairer way. And then we get to Councillor Coleman, who also expressed concerns. He's another longstanding city councillor who's back on city council again now. And in 2018, he said, and again, I quote, "I don't like the way this ended up at the table." But then he ultimately deferred to the City Family and said, and I quote, he was quite willing to show faith that we aren't going to sanitize history. We are not going to take the statue down and shove it off in a dark corner, never to be seen again. I have faith that we will move forward in a way that does allow us to use Sir John A. Macdonald in a repurposed way that acts as a classic point of education. But I recognize we have made people very angry in this process, and that has not been helpful, end quote. So again, his concern was about the process. There was a debate about this before council, and then Mayor Lisa Helps pipes up in response to this debate, and she made a public commitment, this is her words, public commitment to reflect to the family the conversation that's been had at this table today, and to take very seriously all the words that have been shared here in public. Ultimately, though, the motion to endorse the decision of the City Family did pass City Council, with only Councillor Young dissenting. Councillors Madoff and Coleman ultimately did vote for it. And the one caveat that was added was that the mayor, then I quote, keep her public commitment to, and make the family aware of the request, or make the family aware of the words spoken today. So that is a commitment. But basically phrasing this as a request to the City Family, the way I see it, they're basically making council a subcommittee that reports back to the City Family. And if you nicely ask the City Family to accommodate your request, then they might do it in one of their secret meetings. This is apparent from the mayor's next statement. She says, the City Family may actually say, well, thanks for your request. And here's all the work we're doing, and here's the time it's going to take. And actually, we're going to do something that's different from that. End quote. So that's it really shows the power dynamic between City Council, which is supposedly the decision-making body that's elected by the people, and this shadowy group of basically anonymous people who meet in secret. Some of them are on council, but they seem to be handpicked by the mayor, and they get to make this decision. So it's really this goes a lot broader than just the removal of statues and monuments. If decisions are being made in this way, City Council is just a formality. They're just a rubber stamp. They don't even seem to have any power, and the councillors themselves seem to be playing into that. What do you think of that, Jaymee? Specifically, like the councillors like Madoff and Coleman, were they in on this, or were they just duped?
I don't know about them specifically, but I mean, just, yeah, the way that it seems like the mayor is, oh, I have to answer to the family. It's like, why do we even have elected officials if they're not accountable to the public, but they're accountable to this, secret family that's, like who are these people? You know, why, how are they, why are people that we elected to have authority in certain matters deferring to another group, and where does this power come from in this group, and why are they answering to them? And I mean, is this fear based? I mean, what would be the reason that these people are deferring to this group of advisors? But it seems like there's something backing up these you know, this advice seems more threatening if people are just, you know, not really able to say yes or no to this advice. If they have to basically do what they've been advised to do by the family, that doesn't really seem like a democratic process to me.
No, no, it's not. And I think it was really interesting, the word that Chris Coleman used. I have faith. I have faith that they will do this properly. And I mean, I know Chris Coleman to be he's got a reputation as a good man and a man of faith. And I've always had positive interactions with him. But I think it's interesting that somebody like that is just saying, well, I have faith in this. I have faith in this process. When really the role of an elected representative is to apply reason to the process and to be the process, not just have faith that somebody else is doing it correctly. So I was disappointed in Councillor Coleman over that. But I think a lot of representatives will see this, something like the city family, as almost a matter of religious doctrine. And I think it comes back to, for lack of a better term, the woke mentality. This idea that you have to buy into certain causes to be welcome in polite political society, and those causes, even if they're good causes, they shouldn't come at the expense of a fair process. They shouldn't come at the expense of our basic. I think in some contexts, it's starting to erode our basic constitutional rights and freedoms, like freedom of speech and freedom of assembly. And you have to have different points of view. And different points of view should be reflected on city council. So when councillors are obviously uncomfortable with the process being followed, I think there's a real onus on them to stand up and to ensure a proper process. So I feel like the council in this situation, with the obvious exception of Councillor Young, but the other councillors really dropped the ball, and that was disappointing.
Yeah, and also just, you know, it's like when you're picking and choosing which group you're going to make happy by allowing statues, like that's never going to happen in a multi-cultural city with diverse people with diverse interests and what they would feel comfortable or not. So if you have to remove certain statues for certain groups of people to feel okay, like where does that end, and which group are you deferring to? Because not everybody's going to be happy with all the statues. Like we should be able to live in a city where we like some of the stuff and we don't like some of the stuff, but there's space for both of them, or else none of them, right? Like it shouldn't just be certain things to make certain groups, because then there's a power differential and it's catering to one group above another. And the whole point of having elected officials is to like have a balance where people can live in a city where it's not you know, just one group pushing their, you know, beliefs or agendas or even likes or preferences onto the rest of the group, right? There should be a process where, you know, there's some fairness and some give and take and a little bit of balance between opposing groups and interests and what they like and don't like. And it sort of needs to be, you know, a little bit of everything or nothing. It can't just be like very specific to like we're going to erase this one statue based on, you know, how we think a certain group of people will feel, because then it's kind of putting the groups in a hierarchy of importance and like, and that's not really democratic in my opinion either.
No, and the idea of the statue being recontextualized or repurposed was the idea that they would put it somewhere with maybe a plaque talking about the problematic aspects of Macdonald's legacy, and then maybe have some kind of First Nations monument nearby, and have a way that people could come together in conversation in a more neutral way that reflects society's differing views of this person. So it's not just blindly celebrating him or blindly condemning him, but having a space for a conversation. That's, I think, what Councillor Coleman meant when he said, I have faith that this is going to happen. And unfortunately, that public commitment that the mayor made to recontextualize and not sanitize history, that was a lie. She completely broke that commitment, and she did that. I think she knew she was lying when she said it, but that's unfortunate. The process, of course, the procedural argument I made was at the ombudsperson's office. I pretty much gave up on that. I figured, well, they're obviously not going to get back to me. It's been, the statue came down on August 11th. There was a huge protest, a huge gathering of people downtown, both pro-statue and anti-statue. It was lots of police there. It was generally people maintained order, but there was a lot of anger, let's just say, and some people very adamantly supporting the statue's removal, and obviously some who were concerned about the process and who would prefer to see it remain. But I figured after that, things there was a flurry of letters to the editor. Most members of the community, I would say, like just people who wrote to council or who wrote to the newspaper, the vast majority felt that it was wrong to remove the statue. They felt that they hadn't been adequately consulted. The weight of public opinion was against what the mayor was doing. But of course, once the statue comes down, the status quo favors keeping it down. And the status quo is sometimes 9/10 of the battle in politics, which is, I think, why they wanted to get it out of there so fast. But finally, and I was surprised that this happened, but in February 12th of 2021, 2.5 years, almost to the day later, I got a response from the Office of the Ombudsperson. And it was a 4-page letter. I'm not going to go over every word of it, but they talk about the conversations they had with the city about the process and about the city's objective was to ensure reconciliation and respect for First Nations. But they recognized my point that this was not the proper decision-making process under the community charter. And I'll just quote briefly from the letter that I got from their office. They say, with respect to the conduct of city family meetings, there is an arguable case that the meetings of the city family should have remained open in accordance with Section 93 of the Community Charter. However, the city has indicated that the First Nations did not wish to have the meetings conducted in this way. The Community Charter provides City Council the ability to hold meetings in camera pursuant to a number of specific reasons that are set out in the Community Charter. The city family does not appear to strictly fall within any of these categories either. The city has acknowledged that it made an error in the way that it initially commenced the city family process. The City Council established the city family, but did not record the meetings, publish minutes of the meetings, or allow the public to attend the meetings. The city states that they recognize that the city family should not have been conceived as an advisory body of council and was never intended to be an advisory body. This was the basis for their 2019 resolution. So they accepted ultimately that this is not a properly constituted body. It doesn't fit into any category of the community charter. It's just nothing. It's just a bunch of people getting together and meeting. It has no power. And yet it made this very significant and controversial decision. So I wrote back and I said, okay, so this makes the decision invalid, right? When's the statue going back up? And the Ombuds office did not go along with that idea at all. They just said, well, ultimately City Council voted on it. City Council made a decision, and there's nothing we can do about it. So this ombudsperson's office that's supposed to represent the community and make us listen to, I think it's a bit of a red herring, and it just makes it's a way of delaying for 2.5 years and making the problem go away. What do you think? Have you had experience with the ombudsperson's office at all, or offices like it?
No, but I think that's pretty standard to kind of, delay people through paperwork and just kind of make a sort of a labyrinth they have to go through. That's going to basically, if you had a scale and you're balancing out the amount of effort, the amount of payoff, I mean, somebody has to be very, very attached to the outcome in order to exert so much energy in order to get the outcome they want. And they sort of set up multiple kind of cul-de-sacs or labyrinths. You could imagine them as, mostly of paperwork that will just basically occupy a person's time and delay things also, like to the point by when you actually get the information, it's almost irrelevant at that point because so much time's gone by. And so it's just kind of a way to keep people on this kind of slow moving treadmill, feeling like they're moving forward, but never actually accomplishing or solving the problem. And that just seems really standard for a lot of agencies that, are basically wanting to have the illusion that they're accountable to the public. Like, I'm actually quite impressed that you even got a response at all. But obviously 2 years that's a pretty long period of time to address a very simple and pertinent question that would be quite a simple answer. Like it could have been dealt with that day.
Yeah, and I was seeking a remedy that day, so it was very ironic that I have 2.5 days to get a remedy, and the remedy I want, and then they get back to me 2.5 years later and say there is no remedy. Again, this is like I see a lot of I see a lot of the kind of Kafkaesque system of document of the paper mill, the government paper mill, make people feel better, make people feel like something's being done, create all these jobs of people who work away in an office somewhere. And I have friends who've worked for the ombudsperson's office, and without going into detail of what they said there, the office does not seem to be the most efficient place or the most meaningful place to work. It seems like there's a lot of make work project kind of tossing back and forth of letters and that kind of thing without any substantive difference being made to the process. So yeah, I was surprised to get a response after all that time. I figured, okay, well, at least the city's acknowledged that this wasn't the right way to proceed. Maybe they could just not do it again, hopefully. So that's where I didn't have any power to do anything further than that. Then, of course, in 2021, as many people will remember, there was a discovery made in Kamloops of what appeared to be some graves around the residential school. It wasn't clear necessarily whose graves these were, but some of them might have been students who passed away in the residential school, which is obviously very sad, and it made people very upset that even the possibility that might be the case. It's still, I mean, I'm not here to express an opinion one way or the other on whose graves these were, but I think there's debate about the extent to which these were students or teachers or people from the church. Or there was definitely, though, it seems, some evidence of bodies being found there, and this led a lot of people to be very concerned in June of 2021. And a decision was made by the city council to cancel Canada Day that year on the basis of this finding in Kamloops. And the reason, the basis for which they made this decision was that the city family had decided that Canada Day should be canceled. So after saying the city family is not an advisory body, they've told the ombudsperson this, the ombudsperson has told me this, we get the mayor, Lisa Helps, sponsored and seconded by Marianne Alto, who was a councillor at the time and is the current mayor of Victoria. And they say, and I quote in their motion, having the opportunity at the Songhees ceremony on Tuesday to gather with the city family, the city's reconciliation advisory body, still calling it an advisory body, they say, we asked the members of the family for their thoughts on how to proceed with respect to Canada Day. They advised that it would be difficult to proceed with a regular celebration this year, and that it would also feel odd to do nothing. They also noted that we have our first family gathering since last fall next Wednesday, and that might be a good time to discuss options. Some members also noted that we should take our direction and seek input from both the Songhees and Esquimalt chiefs. So basically here we have again, the city family has told the mayor, let's not proceed with Canada Day this year. The mayor is now making a motion 4 months after the city admits that this isn't the proper process. The mayor is making a motion to give effect to the city family's recommendation. And then it says the recommendation is that council direct staff to put on hold plans for the conventional Canada Day celebration this year, and request that staff either A, do nothing further with respect to July 1st events this year, or B, work with the Songhees and Esquimalt chiefs, the city family, and the longstanding Lekwungen participants in the city's Canada Day celebrations to explore the use of an hour-long TV broadcast as an educational opportunity, potentially drawing on the footage of the reconciliation dialogues. And so essentially they're directing staff who are not elected, they're just bureaucrats, to make a decision in concert with the city family, so that all the city council's agreeing to do is, oh, we're canceling Canada Day and we're going to let the city family decide what we're going to have in its place. That's this exactly the same decision-making process that they just admitted is flawed. So it's like there's no accountability here whatsoever, is the only conclusion I can draw.
Right. And I'm just kind of seeing a theme of, kind of manipulating people's virtue by acting like they're making these decisions based on, virtuous, intent, by saying, oh, because of this trauma or this dark history, or out of consideration for these people, or, so they're kind of like manipulating people's empathy into thinking, oh, well, that's a good thing, like, because people do care about these issues and I care about these issues. But I mean, at the end of the day, that's separate from an actual process, because if they can just basically make whatever decisions they want and then say, well, there was a virtuous reason for it, then that to me is really dangerous. And I think that people kind of, get manipulated into that without really being aware of how dangerous that really is, because where does that line end? And like, how could they keep going with that process? And then who gets to define what is a virtuous reason to do things? And so I think they, a lot of Canadians, part of our cultural identity is to be nice, caring, empathic people that care about others and want to do the right thing. And that's part of our cultural identity as Canadians. And so when they kind of bring up these issues that activate our heart and make us feel, that we care about these issues, then we kind of seem to let the democratic process slide based on, the issue that was slid for, right? So I mean that's a very, very dangerous thing in my opinion, because that can end up in a really, that's just kind of a slippery slope that's going to start in one place and can end up somewhere. You're not going to be able to tell when these decisions are being made from a virtuous place or not anymore once we start letting the process slide. And that's why these processes are in place. So we should never actually budge on the proper process going down, despite what the reason is, or, whether it's for a good reason or not. That's actually irrelevant to the process being followed.
Yeah, well said. If it can be used for a good reason, it can be used for a bad reason. And the very kinds of things that are being the great concern is expressed about, things like the residential school system wasn't very accountable to the parents, wasn't very accountable to the people who it was supposed to be helping. So and of course the students, but is the solution to that less accountability now? It just seems like they're doing the exact kind of laying the groundwork for the same kind of thing to happen in the future. Because there are dark chapters in our past, but that doesn't mean that our future is, or our present is, all enlightened and perfect. There's a lot of dark energy and dark intentions, frankly, still in our political system. So
right.
What happened ultimately was they had some kind of event down at the Inner Harbor. I'm not sure if it was the extent to which the city was involved in organizing it, but it was an event of people wearing orange shirts. That became the trendy thing to do to grieve and to mourn these people in the graves in Kamloops. And they kind of brought out this the big catchphrase of this was "Every child matters," which is a very obviously something that we should all agree to. Every child matters. I found that one really interesting because during the Black Lives Matter movement, some people would say all lives matter. You'd hear Black Lives Matter and you'd say all lives matter, including Black lives, but also other lives as well. We don't want to denigrate anybody. But all lives matter became a very politically incorrect thing to say, and it was unacceptable, and it was considered racist if you said that, which is interesting because it's essentially in America, it's the first line of the Declaration of Independence is we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed by their creator with certain natural and inalienable rights. And then that becomes a racist thing to say all of a sudden. But in Canada, you couldn't say all lives matter, but you could say every child matters. And it's just like so the inconsistency there, like you can't say the one thing and you have to say the other. It's like it creates just a weird mental place where cognitive dissonance can thrive, would be my thought. Any psychological insights on that, Jaymee?
Yeah, it is really interesting how people can hold those two ideas at the same time. It's just so obvious, right? Like it's just so simple and so obvious. But I mean, I don't really know what to say to it because I mean, to me, it's just so obvious, and I really can't. I don't really understand how people could get mad at all lives matter. Like I just, to me, that's just so interesting that they could have that cognitive dissonance. But that seems to be a trend going on right now where our society is just becoming more and more obfuscated on all levels, where people are just kind of able to walk around with these contradictory ideas and not really put them out, externalize them and put them on paper and look at them and say like these two things, they can't both be true at the same time. So but it seems that people with this kind of postmodernistic society seem to think they can just sort of decide that they want to believe these two things that are opposing at the same time, and that's okay. And to me, that's just part of the trend of where our society is going. But I think what comes to mind for me is just the way that a lot of our dark history happened was by just assuming that these authority figures know best and that they can be these kind of parental figures to make decisions for the rest of us, and then having these advisors that are whether they're considered legitimate because of their work history or their academia or something that somehow gives them this legitimacy to advise in these matters. It's really quite scary because if you look at the residential school systems, and I mean that's a lot of power for groups to have to come in and actually take people's children. I mean, I don't know what would be a further line than that to actually come into a family and override the parental authority and take actual children and apprehend them. Like, I mean, that's to me, I don't think there's really any more authority a government could take. And so when these people are letting these this kind of government abuse of authority slide based on the idea that it's based on virtue, to me that's really scary because that's how these things happened in the past. And erasing that history, it's like the saying of people who forget history are doomed to repeat it. And so by erasing cultural identity, by erasing historical figures, and by just sort of like allowing these things to slide through the democratic process because they're for apparently virtuous reasons. I mean, to me, that's a really scary place that could end up exactly which would have been the place where these things were happening in the past in the first place. So, I mean, that's the way that I look at this stuff, but I don't know if a lot of people would agree with me at this time on it, but I've studied this stuff a lot. And I always wonder, people wonder how these things could happen. And it's like, well, if you look at how much, deference there was to just these authority figures to allow that to happen, assuming that they know best. And that's what we see happening now, where people don't seem to be upset that these advisory boards that are like, outside of the process, or these people just making decisions and allowing that and saying, oh, well, they know best. And they're kind of these authority figures that we should let them make these decisions. I mean, that's exactly what led to a lot of this dark history in the first place. So I think bringing awareness to that is really important at this time.
Yeah, and it's just people. The vast majority of people I've realized from watching politics over the last few years, and especially watching people's behavior during the COVID period, most people are content to be sheep. Most people are content to follow the mob, and if the mob says it's okay to say you have to say every child matters, then they'll go along with that. If they say you can't say all lives matter, they'll go along with that. But if the inverse were true, if the mob or the people controlling the narrative were to say now it's okay to say all lives matter, but it's not okay to say every child matters, most sheeple would just flip on a dime. So, and that's
Yeah.
how authoritarianism takes place. That's how dark ideas take control of society. And this woke mentality of, oh, we have to buy into all of these virtuous causes, that can be used for darkness. And that's what a lot of the well-intentioned people who just go along with it don't seem to grasp that. But I'm always trying to put that message forward and tell people to think critically about what are you buying into here, because it's
and how your virtue is really being used against you, like where you're coming from a good place, you're coming from your heart, you're coming from empathy, you're coming from emotion, you're coming from care, and those are all really great things, but you can't disconnect it from the mind too, because if someone just activates you here and starts using that for an agenda and you're not aware of the other parts that are in the mind separate from the emotion, then that's where it starts to get really scary, because they can just harness all the emotional energy of these people into these agendas, and people think they're doing something really good and they're actually not. And from the time we're little kids, we go to school and we're basically taught that conformity is a virtue. Like you're a good girl if you listen to the teacher and you sit in your desk and you do what you're told, and and if you give the correct answer to what they've asked you, it's then you're good, right? So people think they're good by conforming. They actually feel like a good, virtuous person by going along with these kind of pre-made, opinions for them. And I just think it's really important to just see that there's like another level to that, where that can be one of the most manipulative things, because it's not so obvious what the agenda actually is that they're harnessing your heart energy into. And so it's like having another level of awareness. And then there's the other side of it too, where when people start to question these things and look at it technically and logically and in their brain, and to kind of separate it from the heart, just to even look at it, logically, it's like we're seen as people that don't care. And that couldn't be further from the truth. Like, that's why we're going over the facts and logic, is because we actually care so deeply. But I mean, there comes a place where you kind of have to separate them out, to look at them separately, instead of just getting sort of caught up in this emotion and then used for an agenda.
Yeah, well, it's certainly easier to follow the mob and be conformist. And I think an example of that can be seen at this celebration of whether it's a morning event or a celebratory event, I don't know. But what happened on July 1st, 2021 was pretty chilling to me, because these people came together to wear orange shirts and say every child matters, and to stand with the First Nations communities, which is a very well-intentioned thing, and something that I'm sure that many in those communities appreciated at the time. But it turned dark very quickly, and there was a mob that formed around the inner harbor of Victoria. They formed around the statue of Captain James Cook, who was the first British explorer to arrive on Vancouver Island and what is now British Columbia. And he was known in around 1776. He arrived and he was just exploring. He wasn't settling. He was a map maker, and he met briefly passing through with some of the First Nations in the area. It was a peaceful meeting. There was some trading that went on, and then he moved on with his ship and his crew. And he was eventually killed in Hawaii by some of the indigenous people there. But his relations with the West Coast Lekwungen-speaking people of Vancouver Island was by all accounts quite peaceful, and he certainly didn't do anything to domineer them or harm them. He traded with them, and that's, you could say it's a form of colonialism to explore, but this was not a person who was setting out to do harm. This was a person who was setting out to explore, and his statue stood for many, many years at the harborfront in Victoria. Quite a beautiful statue, and a mob formed around it on July 1st, 2021. Police were nearby at the time to supervise this ceremony, where thousands of people had gathered. And around 8 p.m., some people started breaking off from the gathering, and they marched towards the statue on the 700 block of Government Street. And when they arrived, the statue was pulled down and thrown into the water, thrown into the harbor. And I find it baffling what the Victoria Police Department said. A spokesperson for the Victoria Police Department said afterwards, it was really quite a moving and profound gathering and ceremony, just a sea of orange downtown to reflect on the painful legacy of the residential school system in Canada. This is the police department that was there. They were watching this happen. They were watching a part of our history being torn down by vandals, a mob of vandals, and tossed into the harbor. And they did nothing. It makes me wonder, like, whose side are the police on? You'd think they're supposed to be maintaining peace and order and good government. That's what our Constitution tells us the government is really for, the police are for. But in this case, they were endorsing lawlessness. That's the only way that I can see this.
endorsing and enforcing the will of political agendas, which police are supposed to, technically supposed to follow the law and, be, advocates for the law. But I mean, now we've seen this, I've seen this all over in recent events. It's like the police are very much an extension of a certain political class of people's will. And so it's very much certain groups are being given benefits of protection, and other certain political groups are not. And so it's very, very political. It's not neutral. It's not just based on a law that's supposed to apply equally to all. It's like very specific groups are being given protections. And I think that regardless of what group people identify or sympathize with, I think it's very, very scary when the police become political instruments rather than neutral enforcers of a law that's supposed to be equal.
Yeah, because if it can be used by one group on against another, it can be used in reverse the next week or the next month. And we've all heard the stories of some of the police behavior in the United States with the very events that triggered the Black Lives Matter protests, were that the police were racially motivated on one side against another. And that's obviously when those allegations are borne out and true, that's a horrible thing, and that needs to be dealt with, and there needs to be accountability for that. But it can't be just flip it and say, okay, now we're going to persecute a different race or a different group or a different class. The police need to be neutral, and they need to be seen as neutral. They need to be seen as somebody that anybody in society can go to if they need help. And sadly, in this case, I mean, this was so preventable. If the police had just stepped in and said to the people who were chiseling away at the statue, "You got to stop this now," they likely could have de-escalated the situation. And if they'd kept doing it, a public arrest in that moment would have made the mob disperse. But even after the incident happened, this was all on camera. There were surveillance cameras everywhere for a big event like this. They do that now. We live in a surveillance society, so it's not hard to determine who these people are. There's pictures of them just tossing the statue into the harbor and tearing it down. This was done with tools over a number of minutes. It wasn't something that just happened instantly in the under cover of night. So, and yet they didn't arrest any suspects. They said, "Oh, we have some suspects, but we're not proceeding at this time," basically because they were political actors, and it would be politically not expedient to arrest these people. And the double standard can be seen so obviously in this particular case, because later that night, some misguided person tried to take the law into their own hands and lit fire to a totem pole up on the Malahat, and the police said that it was a related incident, which seems fair to assume, because the totem was marked with the words "One totem, one statue" spray painted on the cement barrier. And the police, of course, say they are working with the Vancouver Island Forensic Identification Section to identify a suspect. So they're working really hard to identify and arrest the person who burned the totem, when they know perfectly well who tore down the statue and instigated this whole thing. And I'm not making excuses for anybody vandalizing a totem. That's absolutely wrong. But the fact is that you allow lawlessness in one area, you're going to get it in another area. And this is just such a blatant double standard with the way the police respond.
It always kind of makes me laugh that they have serve and protect on the car, because I always think, who are they serving and who are they protecting? And people sort of fill in the end of that sentence to assume it's the public. And I think with acts like this, they're obviously serving another group and protecting other groups, and it's not the public that they're serving and protecting.
Yeah, and I think it goes back to really what happened with the John A. Macdonald statue in 2018. The city did not follow the law. They did not follow the community charter or the procedural laws. They created a condition where, the city families made the decision, we're just going to pull it down. And that emboldens thugs, frankly, lawless thugs, to go and take the law into their own hands. And that is what led to the conditions where a gang of thugs could tear down a statue with impunity. And that being seen causes another thug to go and burn a totem. So there's a chain of cause and effect here, that when the law is not objectively enforced, where the law is treated as a political instrument, it's like the broken window, the broken window effect, where if you have a neighborhood where half the windows are broken, or you have a neighborhood that's covered in graffiti, it's a lot easier for the next thug to come along and tag a wall or smash a window, because it's seen as people not caring. And I think when our political processes are so tattered and torn that people don't respect them anymore, you're going to get more lawlessness on both sides. You're going to get more people acting out in ways that we can't even anticipate. And that, when it reaches a tipping point, it can lead to real social unrest and violence. And I think we saw it in the United States during the Black Lives Matter movement. There was great distrust between police and African American communities, and it led to the police misbehaving, and it led to many of the protesters misbehaving by looting, by starting fires. And peaceful protest, I'm a huge supporter of peaceful protest. I think people need to protest. But the moment it starts becoming violent and vandalism starts happening, that's just, there's a very thin line between that and violence breaking out. And that's what worries me when I see these kinds of things happening. It's all enabled by a system that doesn't play by its own rules.
Right. I mean, the whole point that we have a system is for a social contract for mutual benefit, so that society can function in a certain way for, the safety and benefit of there even being a society, right? And so when those structures start to break down because they're not actually being used the way they were set up to be used, then we are regressing into a Hobbesian state of nature, which is not going to be beneficial for anybody. And we see this happening over the last couple of years in the States and here, but it's really dangerous to think that that's okay, regardless of what the reason is, because if the structure breaks down, it's going to break down for everybody, and we're not going to have these systems functioning appropriately anymore. So we need to actually sort of nip these things in the bud before they actually get too far to control. And like every time we let these little things slide, it's just setting a precedent for it to actually get worse. It's not even going to stay the same. I think we see that with the way that people are actually, starting to just lose faith in institutions and take the law into their own hands. And, these things that have been happening over the last couple of years are really starting to show that a lot of people are just, fed up with trying to actually work within the structure and are going outside of it at this point. And I mean, I don't think that's going to end up in a really great place for a lot of people with the level of, morality and consciousness in a lot of our humanity at this time.
Yeah, and the perfect example of that is with my attempts to play within the rules, play within the system. I get a meaningless letter back 2.5 years later telling me I was right, but absolutely no remedy. Whereas the vandals who tore down Captain Cook, they got what they wanted. Captain Cook's still out of there, and it was decided in January 2022. By the way, it was the CEO of the Greater Victoria Harbour Authority said that they had pulled the statue out from the harbor. They fished it out somehow, and he said, "Oh, it was significantly destroyed and beyond repair." So now the conversation turns to what could go in its place. And the Harbor Authority said it will foot the bill for the removal of the 6-foot concrete block that held the statue, and the 2 affixed bronze plaques will be returned to the city of Victoria. So I assume the bronze plaques will never be seen again, and the concrete block will be removed at the taxpayer's expense. And the vandals got exactly what they wanted just by breaking the law. So the incentive structure here, we talked a little bit on our last show about the incentive structure for children in care and for people who work in that system. Well, the incentive structure in this context seems to be to break the law, not to follow the law. And then for politicians, it's to break their promises, because as the mayor once promised that there would be a recontextualization or a repurposing of the statue, that promise was broken. And it was broken right at a time when things could have changed, when there could have been a public conversation, because it was during an election campaign. I was a candidate in that election campaign last fall in 2022. And rather than allowing that debate to play out and have a conversation about how to repurpose John A. Macdonald, the council again swiftly and quietly passed a resolution that the statue would be removed from the city. It would be taken away. It was returned to the John A. Macdonald Society, which is the organization that first donated it to the city back in the 1970s. But it was returned under conditions that the society will not permit the sculpture to be displayed on Vancouver Island without the expressed approval of the local First Nation or nations on whose territory the statue would stand. The motion noted the society's intention is to safeguard the statue, not to seek a place of public display. So essentially they said, we want it out of the city and you don't get to show it to anybody ever. And the society apparently went along with these conditions, which I think are pretty draconian and pretty disrespectful for any group calling itself the John A. Macdonald Society, because you'd think that they would want to put the statue in proper historical context and use it as a way of teaching people about the legacy of this man who did some good and some bad, and we can learn a lot from both the good and the bad. But the city seems to want to completely erase his memory and ensure that he can never be publicly displayed again. So it's all about whitewashing and brainwashing and removing the conversation. We're not even allowed to have a conversation about this in an election year. They just want the decision has to be made so that, because the people can't be trusted to even talk about it. So demoralizing and discouraging that our city is governed by people like that, and is still governed by people like that. I'll have plenty more to say about municipal politics on future episodes, but they do not, they're not accountable to the citizens, and they don't want to be accountable to the citizens. That's the really concerning thing from my perspective.
I also think it's rather interesting how people are kind of advocating for their own infantilization, where they need the state to protect them from certain parts of history that are good or bad. Where, like, I mean, in the past, people weren't able to necessarily access all of the history, around a statue. They might have just taken it at face value, but now we have the internet. Anybody that wants to research the history of John A. Macdonald, it's all public there. They can go and research it. So it's really their own decision if they want to just remain in ignorance and assume that all of reality is constructed by whatever statues are around them, and they're not going to take it upon themselves to actually educate themselves on, the history of these people and these figures in Canadian history. And when I think about, looking at footage of, the Iraq War, anytime that, they go in and they take over a country, they always destroy the statues right away. Like, that's kind of 101 of going in and taking over a country, is to destroy the statues. It's very symbolic of power and authority structures. It's erasing cultural identity. It's kind of a ritual for the destruction of the old before rebuilding something new. And so I just think to be aware of that and looking at how it's used in global politics, and then when that starts to happen in your own municipality, it's like, what is the real agenda to starting to topple all of these historical figures? Like, I mean, is this kind of the is this kind of like a ritual for, like, something, the destruction of something before a birth, a death and rebirth ritual, where something else is going to be constructed that's going to be this new cultural identity of a city, or this sort of group identity of the citizens in that city. So I think anytime that things are being destroyed, we should just really pay attention to who's destroying it and why, and what are they going to put in its place, and who gets to decide what that is. And I think that regardless of what people think about Sir John A. Macdonald, I think that whole process should just make people pay attention to what's being done here and why and for who.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's about, I think it goes hand in hand with the shredding of our legal institutions. It's sadly ironic that the legal institutions that on which this country was supposedly built are being ignored in the context of removing some of the architects of the society. And it goes, it's another example of this is the Law Society of British Columbia removed the first statue of Chief Justice Begbie, who was, by all accounts in his time, a very enlightened man. He traveled British Columbia on horseback. He learned multiple First Nations languages. He went to the First Nations and tried to help them establish a justice system, and he would have trials. And he was the first judge in Canada to accept the evidence of an Indigenous person over a white person. The problematic thing about his resume or his background is, and he's often referred to now as the hanging judge, because the Chilcotin chiefs who were involved in a battle with some of the gold miners, I believe, in the Fraser Canyon, and Chief Justice Begbie found, well, I think they were found guilty by a jury of murder, because they had indeed, in the context of this of land dispute, had killed some of the settlers in that region. And the only sentence available under the law at the time for murder under Canadian law was death by hanging. So Chief Justice Begbie imposed that sentence. He had no discretion in the matter, and the chiefs were hung. Many years later, I think it was around the same time, 2018 or so, the statue of Chief Justice Begbie was removed from the Law Society building. So his worst sin was upholding the rule of law as it existed at the time. And I'm no fan of capital punishment. I don't believe that was the appropriate law, but I do think that he followed the law to the best of his knowledge and ability at the time, and he was not in it to go around killing First Nations people. And yet now we look back, and the Law Society, the organization that's supposed to uphold the rule of law, is saying this guy needs to be removed because he upheld the rule of law. It's a very perverse idea, and it's like, instead of having the rule of law as something that all of society can benefit from, it becomes a moving target. It becomes the rule of human beings. It becomes the rule of political actors. And when you have the force of the state, I've always considered myself a libertarian, but I do see a role for the state as preventing violence, as protecting people from the basic, creating the basic structure where people can thrive. But the more I look at the way the state interacts with people, the more I think, what is this trade-off? Is this social contract really functioning properly? Because it's all very well to trade yourself out of the Hobbesian state of nature into something better. That's what John Locke talked about. And that's what the social contract is. But if the social contract is delivering worse results than the Hobbesian state of nature, then it seems like it's not a very good bargain anymore. And without the rule of law, then we slide into a very dark place where you just have the guns of the state being used by the most manipulative actors. So that worries me. These conversations can get a little bit dark. So let's try and end with some solutions talk. How do you see, how does the average person engage with this kind of issue? I don't think that, I'm all for writing letters to the ombudsperson, but I can't in good conscience say that that's a solution. So do you have any ideas on solutions or on what ordinary citizens can do?
I think that personally, I think that people should really learn to be in control of themselves instead of trying to control everything around them. And when you see people that are obsessed with changing everything around them, like, oh, that statue can't be there, and this can't be there, and this can't be there because it triggers me, or it affects me, or that's a really powerless place to be in. And nobody's ever going to be happy with the way that everything is in a city. Like, you're not going to make everybody happy. There's just too many people, right? And so when people get really obsessed with changing the external world around them in order for them to feel okay and feel secure and have a sense of power and control, that's actually a really powerless place to be in your life. And so the more they promote that by sort of encouraging you to do that more and more, it's actually disempowering you. Where, really, if you get to the place in yourself where it doesn't, personally, I don't get offended at any statues. Like I said, I don't personally like or dislike any of them. It wouldn't really make a difference to me if they were there or not. But I think that what really gets dangerous to me is when there's some there and some not, and who's deciding that, right? So I think people should just again, from sort of a libertarian point of view, just like really focus on yourself more than focusing on controlling everybody else, because I don't think that's going to work out well, because like I said, no, it's not going to work out to a place where everybody's happy. There's always going to be somebody upset with a statue or a totem or something. Like, it's just impossible to try and change all external reality.
Yeah, and in a world with smaller government, which would be my ideal world, you'd have a lot more spaces that would not be at the behest of the state, or it wouldn't be the government putting forward a approval or disapproval of a particular statue, but you might have more public art, more aesthetically pleasing items and commemoratory things on private property, where you'd have maybe community groups could come together and build something in the park that they wanted to commemorate, and then another community group could build something down the street in the same park, and they would then maybe there could be a conversation. Like, I like to see this devolve down, obviously, to individuals making critical decisions on themselves, and then also communities functioning in a healthy way, civil society. If we had stronger civil society and people could function and make these decisions without the state, then we would be less dependent on the state to determine what is acceptable to see and what is not. And we've come to a world now where I think we're going to do a future show on the whole issue of obscenity and pornography, and where that the effect that has on the mind and on humanity. But like, a lot of things that would have been considered very obscene just a few decades ago are now publicly available to throughout society, even in the eyes of children. And things like a statue, a simple bronze statue of our first prime minister, is considered to be too dangerous or too offensive for members of the community to look at. And the best way of bridging that gap, or reaching a compromise that everybody can live with, is to make sure that things are not, we don't want censorship, but we do want to have conversation, and we do want to have a way that people can be appropriate in their own behavior, in their own way of interacting with their communities. And then you don't need to be policed. But if people depend on politicians and depend on the law to do it for them, you're going to get a very distorted result, and you're going to get whatever's politically popular is going to be always appropriate, and whatever's politically unpopular is going to be always inappropriate. And that leads to, then it's the opposite of real virtue. It's politics determining virtue. So I'm concerned that that's the kind of society we're living in, and I think there's an onus on all of us to step up and try to have these difficult conversations. And when you encounter people who disagree, when you encounter somebody who says, "Oh no, this statue is unacceptable, it needs to be removed," talk to them about why. Why do you think that? Why does this statue threaten you so much in your mind that you can't walk past it? And you might unearth some psychological baggage, and maybe those people should be thinking about that. Like, what is it about this that's so threatening? It's an inanimate object. It's symbolic. But I think as you said, Jaymee, there is great power to symbols, and that's why when they invade Iraq, they immediately, the Saddam Hussein statue came down, because it was symbolic of something deeper. And if it's about shredding our democratic institutions and our constitutional rights, that's what I fear. And I'll certainly be at the leading edge of fighting back against that. So I think, any closing thoughts on what we've talked about today?
Yeah, and just with the kind of combining the toppling of statues with the canceling of Canada Day, and comparing that to Iraq, it's really, again, like I said, it's like a ritual of destruction before a regime change. And I think that people, again, get their virtue kind of sucked into thinking it's acceptable. But like, do you really know what this new regime is going to be? If we just allow all of these things to be erased. And when you think about truth and reconciliation, it's like, what is the word truth? You know what I mean? Like, that statue is truth. That really happened. Taking the statue down doesn't actually change the truth of the history. And so, allowing the statue to stand there as a truth, whether it's good or bad, like totally separate from judgment, truth exists whether it's good or bad. It's the truth is the truth, no matter how you like. If you like it, if you don't like it, how you feel about it doesn't change the fact of that actually is history that happened. And I really just encourage people to consider how dangerous it might be to actually erase that truth in order to provide your own comfort. I think that's maybe something that's being promoted right now that I think maybe we should be a little bit wiser than that in especially considering Canadian history and some of the dark aspects of it. I think we should all be very, very aware of these kind of manipulative techniques being used on us. And I think that just, we have the technology now for people to have more discussions about things, not less. So I think that, having these sort of backroom, decision making is, becoming less and less acceptable as we have more and more technology for actually more people to engage in politics and debate, and, to have more discussions on things that are happening that affect everybody in society. We should have actually higher functioning, cities at this time, not less functioning.
Yeah, absolutely. Well said. And I think, the truth, I think in this context is more like the Ministry of Truth in Orwell is what I'm worried about. It's more propaganda than truth, and reconciliation sadly seems to be division. So it's sometimes they say these words when they mean the opposite. But anyway, thanks for discussing this with me. It's been a great conversation. For everybody listening and watching out there, if you want more of these conversations, please give us a like, please give us a follow on YouTube. We're going to be bringing these to more platforms and trying to discuss some of the really critical issues of our day and combine my legal perspective with Jaymee's psychological perspective, and also bring some guests on. We've got some really good ideas for guests in the future, debates. I think that this is going to take on a life of its own, and we're hoping that all of you will come along for the ride. So thanks for watching and listening, and we'll see you again soon. Bye for now.